The blue light of the surveillance monitors cast a dead, synthetic glow over the concrete walls of the subterranean server room. The air conditioning hummed a low, relentless industrial note, keeping the ambient temperature at a rigid 62 degrees to prevent the massive processor banks from overheating. I sat in a heavy ergonomic chair, my spine perfectly straight, breathing in the dry, sterile scent of ozone and chilled dust. A single porcelain cup of espresso rested on the steel table in front of me. The dark liquid had gone completely cold. I traced the smooth, curved rim with the tip of my index finger, feeling the microscopic imperfections in the glaze. On the center monitor, broadcast in high definition from a pinhole camera hidden inside a vintage humidor, my husband was becoming a king. Vincenzo sat behind the massive mahogany desk in the executive office of the Russo family estate in Staten Island. It was my father's desk. The high-backed leather chair seemed to swallow Vincenzo's frame slightly, a subtle physical reminder of a suit that had not yet been tailored to fit him. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit, the silk tie perfectly dimpled, a man dressed for mourning but radiating the contained, electric energy of a lottery winner. Sterling, the family attorney, sat opposite the desk. The old man looked exhausted. He slid a thick, cream-colored document across the polished wood surface. Even without audio, I knew the exact weight and texture of that paper. Declaration of death in absentia. 3 weeks had passed since the explosion off the coast of Montauk. The Coast Guard had dragged the Atlantic for 8 days. They found pulverized fiberglass, a floating slick of diesel fuel, and the charred remnants of the Louis Vuitton travel bag I always carried. They did not find a body. 200 pounds of seaborne, packed tightly against the hull of an 80-foot yacht, tends to vaporize organic matter, leaving the ocean to swallow the ashes. Vincenzo looked down at the document. T-Born. He did not hesitate. He did not let his eyes linger on my printed name. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a Mont Blanc Meisterstück fountain pen. I bought him that pen for our 5th anniversary. The heavy gold nib flashed under the warm amber lighting of the office. Vincenzo uncapped it. His posture shifted, leaning heavily onto his left forearm as he brought the pen to the paper. A fluid, rapid motion. A flourish at the end of the signature. He capped the pen, slipped it back into his pocket, and pushed the document back towards Sterling. The transaction was complete. The legal ghost of Clara Russo was officially banished to the archives. I watched the muscles in Vincenzo's jaw relax. The subtle, rigid tension that he had carried for the past 3 weeks evaporated from his shoulders. He stood up from the desk, moving toward the antique globe that housed the liquor cabinet. Sterling packed his briefcase, offered a slow, respectful nod to the newly undisputed boss of the Russo family, and exited the room, pulling the heavy oak doors shut behind him. Vincenzo was alone. He poured a generous measure of Macallan 25 into a crystal tumbler. He held the glass up to the light, inspecting the amber liquid. He turned toward the massive bay windows overlooking the manicured lawns of the estate, staring out into the overcast New York afternoon. He raised the glass an inch, a silent, solitary toast to the empty room, to a successful assassination, to absolute power. The cold espresso in my cup tasted like battery acid and burnt earth. I swallowed it down, ignoring the harsh scrape against my throat. The heavy steel door at the far end of the server room clicked. The electronic deadbolt disengaged with a solid, mechanical thud. The sudden draft brought the smell of damp wool and cheap, mint-scented aftershave into the sterile environment. Rocco Valenti stepped into the room. He was a massive man, built like a brick retaining wall, his broken nose and cauliflower ear standing as monuments to 30 years of brutal, bloody work on the streets of Brooklyn. According to Vincenzo's meticulous, paranoid ledgers, Rocco was his most loyal capo, the muscle, the enforcer who was supposed to keep the other factions in line while Vincenzo consolidated the throne. Rocco did not look at the surveillance monitors. He walked directly to the steel table and dropped a heavy, battered leather briefcase onto the surface. The Port Authority shift captains cleared the manifests, Rocco said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the hum of the servers. The shipments from Odessa bypassed customs at Born, Am, 8 containers, military-grade hardware. It's sitting in the Red Hook warehouse. Vincenzo's shipment. I noted, my eyes remaining fixed on the screen where my husband was now casually thumbing through a stack of union contracts. Vincenzo thinks it's his shipment, Rocco corrected, pulling a thick stack of bearer bonds from the briefcase. He arranged them neatly next to my empty espresso cup. He wired the payment through the Cayman accounts yesterday, but the port captains don't report to the Cayman accounts. They report to the pension fund. The pension fund. The invisible, untraceable pool of clean money my father had set up 3 decades ago, buried so deep under shell corporations and legitimate real estate holdings that not even Vincenzo, the family's chief accountant before he married me, knew it existed. I reached out and touched the crisp edge of the bearer bonds. And the capos in Queens? Rocco crossed his thick arms over his chest. The leather of his jacket creaked. Sal and Jimmy got the message. They are holding the weekly collections. Vincenzo will see a 60% drop in revenue by Friday. He'll think the Irish are bleeding his territory. He will react, I said, watching Vincenzo pick up the landline phone on his desk. He is an accountant pretending to be a warlord. When the numbers drop, he will panic. He will try to use force to balance the ledger. He'll order me to hit the Westies, Rocco grunted. Accept the order, I replied smoothly. Take his men, deploy them to the safe houses in Hell's Kitchen, and then lock them in, strip them of their weapons, confine his loyalists. Vincenzo had planned my murder with the clinical detachment of a man auditing a tax return. He had spent 2 years manipulating my father's aging lieutenants, buying silence, isolating me within the walls of my own estate. He thought he was playing a grand game of chess, moving the pieces until the Queen was trapped on a burning yacht. He never realized the board he was playing on was entirely fabricated. I had known about the Seabourn for 6 months. I smelled the chemical tang of the plastic explosives on his custom-tailored suits. I saw the micro-deposits transferring to the bomb maker in Brighton Beach. I let him build the trap. I let him arm it. Because a living boss is constantly questioned, constantly challenged. A dead boss, resurrected as a phantom pulling the strings from the absolute dark, is invincible. While Vincenzo was busy, every single capo, every union boss, every corrupt precinct captain he thought he owned had been quietly transitioned to my shadow ledger. They smiled at him. They kissed his ring. They took his orders. But they cashed my checks. On the center monitor, Vincenzo slammed the landline phone down. The relaxed posture was gone. His shoulders hitched up toward his ears. He grabbed his cell phone, his thumb tapping the screen aggressively. 3 seconds later, the cheap, untraceable burner phone resting on the steel table next to the bearer bonds began to vibrate. Rocco looked at the vibrating phone, then up at me. A grim, predatory smile stretched across his scarred face. He's calling me, Rocco rumbled. Probably wants to know why the port captains aren't answering his calls. I picked up the burner phone. The vibration transferred a chaotic, nervous energy into the palm of my hand. I looked at the screen. The caller ID was a scrambled sequence of numbers. Let it ring, I commanded, dropping the phone back onto the table. Vincenzo paced behind his mahogany desk. He kicked the antique wastebasket, sending it flying across the plush Persian rug. The carefully constructed illusion of his absolute power was beginning to crack. The ink on my death certificate was barely dry, and already the empire he thought he had inherited was crumbling into dust around him. He didn't own the ports. He didn't own the muscle. He didn't own the money. He owned a signature on a piece of paper. I leaned forward, the glow of the monitors reflecting off the cold surface of my eyes. The true architecture of the underworld is not built on fear or violence. It is built on the absolute control of information. Rocco, I said, my voice dropping to a flat, dead frequency. Tell Dimitri to move his men into Staten Island, surround the estate, cut the hard lines, jam the cellular frequencies. I want my husband to experience the exact sensation of being trapped in a burning room with no exits. The heavy steel door sealed shut behind Rocco, cutting off the draft and leaving the server room bathed once again in the sterile hum of the cooling units. The lingering scent of his cheap, mint-scented aftershave fought a losing battle against the omnipresent ozone. I watched the center monitor. Vincenzo had stopped pacing. The burner phone on his desk had ceased its chaotic vibrating. He stood perfectly still in the center of the Persian rug, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He walked back to the mahogany desk. He did not sit down. He reached beneath the heavy wood, his fingers tracing the invisible seam of the hidden compartment my father had built in the late 80s. The compartment I thought only I knew about. A fractional shift in Vincenzo's left shoulder indicated the application of pressure. A microscopic click echoed through the audio feed. He pulled out a heavy black steel lockbox. The air in my lungs turned to frost. My father had kept the original deeds to the Red Hook warehouses in that box. I had emptied it a year ago, transferring the documents to the Vanguard Trust. The box was supposed to be completely hollow. Vincenzo flipped the heavy latches. He opened the lid. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, tightly bound stack of documents. He did not look at them. He simply placed them on the center of the desk, right next to my freshly signed death certificate. I leaned closer to the high-definition monitor, the blue light reflecting off my retinas. The resolution was sharp enough to read the bold, black lettering stamped across the top of the first page. It was a shipping manifest, but not from Odessa, not the military hardware Rocco had just briefed me on. The manifest bore the insignia of the Volkov Syndicate. The date stamped on the top right corner was tomorrow. I pushed the ergonomic chair back. The wheels scraped harshly against the concrete floor. The false trail began to weave itself into my flawless architecture, a single, jagged thread pulling the tapestry out of alignment. If Vincenzo was an ignorant accountant panicking over lost revenue, he would not have a Volkov manifest locked in my father's secret compartment. He would not know the compartment existed. I left the server room, ascending the narrow, spiraling concrete staircase that led to the loading dock of the defunct meatpacking plant in Hell's Kitchen. The air grew heavier with each step, the sterile chill replaced by the thick, putrid stench of decaying marrow and industrial bleach. Dmitri was waiting by the armored Cadillac Escalade. The Russian lieutenant was a towering slab of muscle wrapped in a tailored navy trench coat. He smoked a thin, dark cigarette, the ash glowing a harsh cherry red in the gloom of the loading bay. The hard lines at the Staten Island estate are severed, Dmitri reported, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the damp air. The cellular jammers are active. We established a 3-block perimeter. Nobody goes in. Nobody comes out. Pull the men back, I commanded, pulling the collar of my cashmere coat up against the draft. Dmitri paused, the cigarette hovering inches from his lips. A micro-expression of confusion flickered across his pale eyes. You ordered a total blackout, Clara. Rocco is moving the loyalists into the safe houses right now to isolate Vincenzo's muscle. Pull the perimeter back to 5 blocks, I said, opening the heavy door of the Escalade. Maintain visual, but leave the access roads completely open. Do not engage any vehicles leaving the estate. I slid into the back seat, the rich smell of conditioned leather masking the bleach from the loading dock. Dmitri climbed into the driver's seat, his heavy frame shifting the suspension of the SUV. He put the vehicle in gear, the massive V-Tarm engine purring to life. We drove out into the relentless, driving rain of the New York evening. The city was a blur of smeared neon and brake lights. The trap I had built for Vincenzo relied on isolation. I wanted to cut his communication, starve his revenue, and watch him suffocate in the dark. But the Volkov manifest on his desk changed the entire geometry of the board. Viktor Volkov was a ghost, a Russian arms dealer who operated strictly in the shadows, supplying the highest bidder. If Vincenzo had a Volkov shipment arriving tomorrow, he wasn't starving, he was arming, and he wasn't using the family funds to do it. The Cayman accounts were frozen. The pension fund was under my absolute control. Take me to Chinatown, I told Dmitri. The drive down the FDR was silent, the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers acting as a metronome for the racing calculations in my mind. We parked in a narrow alley off Mott Street. The alley smelled aggressively of rotting cabbage, spilled soy sauce, and the heavy, sweet smoke of roasted duck hanging in the windows of the restaurants fronting the street. I stepped out into the rain, bypassing the brightly lit storefronts. I approached a heavy, unmarked steel door at the end of the alley. Two men in dark suits stood beneath a dripping fire escape, their hands resting casually inside their jackets. They recognized me. They did not speak. One of them turned and knocked a rhythmic pattern on the steel. The door opened inward. I descended a flight of steep, wooden stairs into a massive, subterranean gambling hall. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, cheap perfume, and the electric tension of 100 men placing desperate bets on pai gow and baccarat. I did not stop at the tables. I walked directly to the back of the room, pushing through a bead curtain into a private office. Mr. Lau sat behind a massive, intricately carved rosewood desk. He was a small, fragile-looking man in his late 70s, wearing a pristine white silk tunic. He was the banker. The man who washed the blood off the money for every major syndicate on the eastern seaboard. Lau did not look up from the abacus he was manipulating with long, manicured fingers. The wooden beads clicked softly in the quiet room. "You are supposed to be ash floating in the Atlantic, Clara," Lau said, his voice a dry, papery whisper. "The water was too cold," I replied, taking a seat in the velvet chair opposite his desk. "I need a ledger trace, Mr. Lau. Vincenzo Russo. I need to know where his capital is flowing from. He just purchased a heavy shipment from the Volkov syndicate, and he didn't use my money to do it." Lau stopped moving the beads. He slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He blinked twice, a slow, deliberate motion. "Your husband has not moved any capital through my networks in 6 months, Lau stated. "That is impossible. Volkov does not operate on credit. He demands 50% upfront, routed through untraceable channels. If Vincenzo didn't use you, who did he use?" Lau reached into the top drawer of his rosewood desk. He pulled out a single, folded sheet of rice paper and slid it across the polished wood. I picked it up. It was a printed transaction log. A wire transfer. $50 million. "The money did not originate from Vincenzo," Lau whispered, pouring a small cup of green tea from a cast-iron pot. The bitter, herbal scent filled the space between us. "The transfer to Volkov was initiated 3 days ago. It bypassed the traditional laundering hubs. It came directly from a private account in Geneva." I scanned the account details on the rice paper. The routing numbers were obscured, but the origin signature was clear. R. Valenti. My heart stalled. A heavy, suffocating block of ice materialized in the center of my chest. Rocco, the man who had just stood in my server room, smelling of mint aftershave, assuring me that he was isolating Vincenzo's loyalists. The enforcer I had secretly paid to betray my husband. I folded the rice paper, my fingers pressing the creases until the edges cut into my skin. The cognitive trap snapped shut, its steel teeth burying into the flawless narrative I had constructed. Rocco wasn't isolating Vincenzo's muscle. He was coordinating with him. The entire performance in the server room, the bearer bonds, the fake Odessa shipment, the burner phone was a theatrical production designed to keep me completely blind to the real movement on the board. They knew I was alive. Vincenzo signing the death certificate wasn't an act of usurpation. It was a declaration of war against a ghost. He signed it to lull me into a false sense of absolute control, knowing I was watching through the hidden cameras. He wanted me to deploy my assets. He wanted me to send Rocco to lock down the safe houses. Because the safe houses were kill boxes, I stood up from the velvet chair. The room suddenly felt incredibly small, the air thinning out. "Thank you, Mr. Lau," I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion. "The board is very crowded, Clara," Lau murmured, taking a slow sip of the green tea. "When a queen sacrifices herself, she must be certain the king does not know how to play the knight." I left the subterranean office, moving fast through the crowded gambling hall. The noise of the patrons sounded like static. I climbed the wooden stairs and pushed out into the freezing rain of the alley. Dmitri was leaning against the escalade. I walked up to him, grabbing the lapel of his navy trench coat. The safe houses in Hell's Kitchen, I demanded, the words tearing out of my throat. Rocco took Vincenzo's loyalists there. Did your men verify the lockdown? Dimitri frowned, the rain slicking his shaved head. My men watched Rocco's vehicles enter the underground garages of the safe houses an hour ago, the heavy steel doors secured behind them. Total lockdown, just as you ordered. Rocco didn't take Vincenzo's men, I hissed, releasing his coat. I pulled my suppressed Walther PPK from my handbag, checking the chamber. He took my capos. He told Sal and Jimmy to meet him there to consolidate the collections. He lured my command structure into sealed concrete boxes. Dimitri's pale eyes widened slightly. The massive Russian instantly reached into his coat, pulling his tactical radio. He keyed the mic. Echo team, sit rep on the kitchen safe houses. Immediate. Static hissed through the speaker. Only static. The rain hammered violently against the roof of the Escalade. The metallic tang of fear began to mix with the smell of the wet asphalt. Drive, I commanded, getting into the back seat. Hell's Kitchen. Now, the Escalade tore out of Chinatown, the heavy tires hydroplaning slightly on the slick streets. We ran 3 red lights, moving relentlessly uptown. The city blurred past the tinted windows. My father had built the safe houses in the 90s. They were retrofitted industrial meat lockers, featuring reinforced steel doors, acoustic dampening insulation, and independent ventilation systems. They were designed to protect the high-ranking members of the family from federal raids or rival hits. Once the external lockdown was engaged, the doors could only be opened from the outside. They were the perfect tombs. We pulled onto Muy Moth Avenue, turning down a dark, narrow street lined with brick warehouses. Dimitri killed the headlights. The Escalade rolled to a silent stop 50 yards from the entrance to Safe House Alpha. The heavy corrugated metal roll-up door of the underground garage was shut. There were no vehicles parked on the street, no lookouts. The perimeter was entirely dead. I stepped out of the SUV, the freezing rain immediately soaking my cashmere coat. I kept the Walther PPK gripped tightly in my right hand, the cold steel grounding me. Dimitri moved silently beside me, a suppressed MP-num submachine gun raised to his shoulder. We approached the small, reinforced pedestrian door adjacent to the main garage entrance. The electronic keypad was dark, smashed. Dimitri reached out, testing the heavy steel handle. It was locked. He stepped back, pulling a small magnetic breaching charge from his tactical vest. He slapped it over the deadbolt mechanism, stepping aside. A sharp, muted pop echoed in the rain. The smell of vaporized copper and ozone flared. Dimitri kicked the door. It swung inward, groaning against the thick hinges. The interior of the garage was pitch black. The emergency lighting had been disabled. The air was stagnant, heavy with the sharp, acidic stench of cordite and the undeniable, coppery scent of massive arterial bleeding. Dimitri clicked on a tactical flashlight attached to the barrel of his MP-num. The harsh white beam cut through the darkness. It illuminated a slaughterhouse. 3 black Lincoln Navigators were parked haphazardly in the center of the concrete floor. Their windows were shattered. The doors were riddled with heavy-caliber bullet holes. Scattered around the vehicles were the bodies of my men. Sal, Jimmy, their drivers, their bodyguards. Over a dozen men gunned down in a crossfire they never saw coming. The concrete floor was slick with a massive, pooling lake of dark blood. Rocco had not isolated Vincenzo's muscle. Rocco had orchestrated the systematic execution of my entire loyalist command structure. He had used my own orders, my own safe houses, to strip me of my army in a single devastating stroke. I walked slowly through the carnage, the soles of my boots sticking to the drying blood. I stopped next to Sal's body. The old capo's eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of absolute betrayal. He had trusted Rocco. He had trusted me. The beam of Dimitri's flashlight swept across the far wall of the garage. Something caught the light. A piece of white paper, nailed to the thick acoustic insulation with a heavy steel hunting knife. I walked over to the wall. The smell of the cordite was suffocating here. I reached out and pulled the paper free. It was thick, cream-colored stock. It was a photocopy of the declaration of death in absentia, but across the bottom, written in thick, dark ink with a heavy gold fountain pen, was a single line of text. "You should have stayed in the water, Clara." The false trail had completely inverted my reality. I was not the spider sitting in the center of the web. I was the fly that had just realized the silk threads were tightening around its throat. Vincenzo had known from the moment the yacht exploded. He had played the grief-stricken husband, he had played the panicking usurper, all while quietly purchasing a private army from Viktor Volkov and turning my most lethal weapon against me. A sudden, sharp mechanical hum vibrated through the concrete floor. The heavy corrugated metal roll-up door of the garage began to rattle. Dmitri spun around, raising his MP num toward the entrance. The door was slowly grinding upward. Through the expanding gap at the bottom, I saw the blinding glare of high-intensity halogen headlights cutting through the rain. The heavy rumble of multiple diesel engines echoed in the narrow street outside. We were locked in a concrete box, standing in a pool of our own men's blood, and the Volkov syndicate had just arrived to clean up the ghosts. The heavy corrugated metal door of the garage ground upward on its rusted tracks, shrieking like a tortured animal. The gap widened, transforming the pitch-black tomb into a blinding theater of high-intensity halogen light. The rain outside was a chaotic curtain of silver needles cutting through the harsh glare. I did not flinch against the sudden light. I dropped my center of gravity, dropping to one knee behind the shattered rear bumper of a bullet-riddled Lincoln Navigator. My thumb swept the safety off the Walther PPK. The metal of the grip was freezing, slick with the ambient humidity and the fine mist of blood that coated the air. Dmitri did not seek cover immediately. The Russian lieutenant was a creature forged in the brutalist doctrine of overwhelming force. He planted his massive boots wide on the blood-slicked concrete, raising the MP num submachine gun to his shoulder. 4 figures materialized in the blinding white glare of the entrance. They were silhouetted, featureless masses of heavy tactical gear, gripping suppressed assault rifles. Volkov's elite. Dmitri pulled the trigger. The MP num roared, a deafening, rapid-fire staccato that shattered the remaining glass in the safe house. The muzzle flash illuminated the garage in erratic, yellow bursts, casting long, frantic shadows across the corpses of my loyalists. Dmitri did not spray blindly. He aimed low, targeting the unprotected pelvic girdles and upper thighs of the silhouettes. The 2 lead operatives crumpled instantly, their legs swept out from under them by the sheer volume of 9mm lead. They hit the wet asphalt outside with heavy, wet thuds, their rifles clattering away. The remaining 2 operatives dove for the cover of the brick alley walls, returning fire. The air in the garage instantly turned into a chaotic swarm of supersonic hornets. The heavy Numfe Numwisau caliber rounds from the Volkov rifles tore through the aluminum body of the Lincoln Navigator as if it were wet cardboard. The impacts were deafening, a relentless, mechanical hammering that forced the breath from my lungs. Sparks cascaded over my shoulders as a bullet struck the steel rim of the tire inches from my face. The smell of cordite became a physical entity, a thick, suffocating cloud of burnt sulfur and metallic dust that burned the back of my throat. Dmitri stepped backward, finally utilizing the cover of the central SUV. His heavy navy trench coat was dusted with pulverized concrete. His breathing was a slow, rhythmic hiss. He ejected the spent magazine of the MP num, the empty metal box clattering onto the floor, and slammed a fresh one home with a brutal mechanical efficiency. They have a heavy gunner mounting a PKM machine gun on the hood of the lead vehicle outside. Dmitri rumbled, his voice perfectly flat, entirely devoid of the adrenaline that was currently setting my nerve endings on fire. The door is jammed at 4 feet. They cannot bring the vehicles in, but they will suppress us until the flankers breach the pedestrian door. I looked at the heavy steel pedestrian door Dmitri had blown open with the magnetic charge just minutes ago. It swung loosely on its hinges, a gaping black hole leading out into the rain. The tactical geometry of the room was a death sentence. We were pinned in the center of a concrete box, illuminated by headlights, facing a numerically superior force with heavier firepower. Vincenzo had not just sent Volkov's men to clean up the bodies. He had coordinated a secondary ambush to ensure the ghost of his wife was permanently exorcised. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I shut out the deafening roar of the gunfire tearing the SUV apart above my head. I visualized the architectural blueprints of the meatpacking plant my father had commissioned in 1994. Industrial freezers required massive drainage systems to clear the chemical runoff from the bleaching processes. "The floor drain," I said, my voice cutting through the noise with absolute icy clarity. I opened my eyes and looked past the front bumper of the ruined Lincoln. 10 feet away, set flush into the blood-soaked concrete, was a heavy cast-iron grate, measuring 3 feet by 3 feet. It was designed to channel thousands of gallons of toxic water into the old storm sewers beneath Hell's Kitchen. "Covering fire," Dmitri grunted, instantly reading my trajectory. He leaned out from behind the rear axle, exposing his upper torso to the fatal funnel of the garage door. He unleashed a sustained, controlled burst of automatic fire toward the halogen lights. The heavy PKM machine gun outside answered immediately. The deafening, rhythmic booming of the belt-fed weapon shook the foundation of the building. A solid wall of lead chewed through the concrete floor, walking a path of destruction directly toward our position. I did not hesitate. I pushed off the rear tire, staying impossibly low, my cashmere coat dragging through the thick, congealing blood of my dead capos. The friction of my knees against the concrete tore the expensive fabric and scraped my skin raw, but the physical pain was irrelevant. Survival is a mathematical equation, and right now, speed was the only variable that mattered. I reached the cast-iron grate. The metal was freezing, covered in a thick layer of industrial grime and fresh blood. I jammed my fingers into the narrow slots. The edges dug into my cuticles, biting the flesh. I braced my boots against the concrete and pulled upward with every ounce of kinetic force my body could generate. The grate did not move. It had been sealed shut by decades of rust and neglect. A bullet impacted the floor 2 inches from my left hand, sending a razor-sharp chip of concrete slicing across my cheekbone. The warm slide of my own blood instantly mixed with the freezing rain blowing in from the open door. "Move," a heavy voice ordered. Dmitri slid into position beside me. His left arm hung limply at his side, the sleeve of his navy coat saturated with a rapidly expanding dark stain. He had taken a round to the bicep. His face betrayed absolutely nothing. The micro-expressions were locked down behind a wall of Spetsnaz conditioning. He dropped the MP-num. He jammed the thick, steel fingers of his right hand into the grate, anchored his massive shoulder against the floor, and roared. It was a guttural, primal sound of raw mechanical leverage. The rust cracked like a gunshot. The heavy iron grate tore free from its housing, flipping over onto the concrete with a deafening clang. Beneath it was a cylindrical concrete shaft, dropping 10 feet down into absolute, impenetrable darkness. The smell rising from the hole was a putrid, suffocating wave of stagnant water, decaying organic matter, and ancient rust. "Go," Dmitri commanded, picking up the MP-num with his good hand. He turned back toward the blinding lights, placing his massive body between me and the incoming fire. I did not look back. I slid feet first into the narrow shaft. The descent was a violent scrape against rough, unfinished concrete. I hit the bottom hard, the impact jarring my spine. I was plunged waist-deep into freezing, foul-smelling water. The temperature shock punched the air out of my lungs. Total darkness swallowed me instantly. A second later, the heavy mass of Dmitri dropped down the shaft, landing heavily in the water beside me. The splash coated my face in the toxic runoff. Before I could speak, Dmitri reached up into the faint square of ambient light above us. He grabbed the heavy iron grate and hauled it back into place, sealing the opening with a loud, metallic slam. The light vanished. The deafening roar of the PKM machine gun was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant, rhythmic thumping vibrating through the concrete ceiling above our heads. The silence in the tunnel was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing and the dripping of water echoing endlessly in the dark. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to a complete lack of photons. The water swirling around my waist felt like liquid ice, rapidly drawing the core heat from my body. I held the Walther PPK above the waterline, my grip tight enough to whiten my knuckles. "Status," I whispered into the void. The sound of heavy fabric shifting, a sharp intake of breath. Through and through, Dimitri's voice rumbled, tight with suppressed pain. "Left bicep. The bone is intact. The artery missed. I am functional. Functional." In the underworld, functionality is the only metric of human value. I reached out with my left hand, tracing the curved, slimy brick wall of the tunnel. This is an old runoff channel. It should connect to the main storm sewer line running parallel to the Hudson. We move west. Keep your hand on the wall. We began to wade through the black water. The drag of the liquid against my legs was exhausting, a constant, heavy resistance that turned every step into a monumental effort. Debris brushed against my thighs, things I refused to visualize in the dark. The smell of sulfur and rot was overpowering, forcing me to breathe entirely through my mouth. As the adrenaline began to recede, leaving the cold reality of the freezing water and the throbbing cut on my cheek, the perspective flip I had experienced in the garage began to solidify, crystallizing into a terrifying, flawless architecture. I had spent my entire life studying the geometry of power. I had watched my father rule through intimidation and brute force. I had married Vincenzo specifically because he possessed neither. He was an accountant, a man obsessed with ledgers, risk assessment, and profit margins. I wanted a puppet king who would manage the mundane logistics while I operated from the shadows, untouched by the FBI or rival families. I thought I was manipulating a docile clerk. I failed to realize that a man who spends his life staring at numbers understands the ultimate truth of the underworld better than any street soldier. Numbers do not bleed. Numbers do not feel loyalty. Numbers only balance. Vincenzo had not suddenly transformed into a mastermind. He had been planning this coup for years, operating right under my nose, using the very docility I despised as his camouflage. He let me build my shadow network. He let me bribe the capos. He let me set up the Vanguard Trust. He let me fake my own death on that yacht. He didn't try to stop me because my fake death was the absolute most efficient way for him to clean the board. If I disappeared, he legally inherited the throne. But a throne without an army is useless. He knew I had bought the capos. He knew Sal and Jimmy were loyal to me, not him. So, he used my own paranoia against me. He signed the death certificate, knowing I was watching. He baited me into deploying my shadow army, and Rocco. The betrayal that burned the hottest in my chest. Why did Rocco flip? I had paid him triple what Vincenzo paid him. I had guaranteed him a seat at the commission. In the freezing darkness of the sewer, the answer materialized with brutal simplicity. Rocco was a creature of the old world. He respected violence. He respected ruthlessness. I had tried to buy his loyalty with bearer bonds. Vincenzo had bought his loyalty with a blood sacrifice. Vincenzo had offered Rocco the one thing I couldn't, the opportunity to butcher the old guard and take their territories. Vincenzo had looked the beast in the eye and given it permission to feed. I had played politics. Vincenzo had played a massacre. A sudden, sharp sound snapped me out of the cold calculations. It was a splash, 50 yards behind us. I stopped moving instantly. Dimitri froze beside me. We held our breath, turning our heads toward the origin of the noise. The tunnel amplified every acoustic vibration. Another splash, a slow, deliberate step through the waist-deep water. Then another. The grate had been opened. Someone had followed us down. Thermal optics, Dimitri whispered, his voice barely a vibration against the damp brick wall. They have night vision. We are glowing targets in this freezing water. The tactical disadvantage was absolute. We were blind in a narrow, flooded corridor. The pursuer had technological superiority and heavy firepower. I pressed my back against the curved brick wall. I felt the ambient temperature of the water. It was freezing, but my body heat was still radiating, a beacon in the dark. "Sink," I commanded. Dimitri did not question the order. We both bent our knees, dropping our bodies entirely beneath the surface of the foul, freezing water. Only my face remained exposed, my lips hovering inches above the waterline, taking in microscopic breaths of the sulfur-tainted air. The cold shock was agonizing. My muscles instantly seized, violent tremors racking my spine. I clamped my jaw shut to prevent my teeth from chattering. I held the Walther PPK above the water, resting the barrel on the brick ledge. The splashing grew louder, closer. Through the pitch blackness, a faint pale green glow began to manifest on the brick walls, the reflection of an infrared laser sight cutting through the darkness. The operative was moving methodically, scanning the tunnel. He was alone. Volkov's men were disciplined, but sending a full squad down a narrow shaft was a tactical risk. One hunter, fully equipped. The green laser swept across the water, exactly 10 feet in front of me. The splashing stopped. He was close enough for me to smell him. Beneath the stench of the sewer, I caught the sharp, distinct scent of synthetic gun oil and wet nylon. I could hear the slow, measured intake of his breath through his nose. He was looking through his thermal optics. By submerging our bodies in the freezing water, we had drastically reduced our thermal signatures. The water masked the heat. We were no longer glowing red targets. We were faint, ambient blurs against the cold brick. But he knew we were here. The tunnel had no other exits. The green laser began to sweep the walls, moving slowly, deliberately toward my position. I did not raise the gun. The moment I lifted my arm from the freezing water, the heat signature of my exposed limb would bloom on his visor like a flare. I reached down into the black water with my left hand. My fingers brushed the bottom of the tunnel, sinking into a thick layer of decaying sludge and debris. I grabbed a handful of the heavy, putrid mud. The laser dot was 5 feet away. The operative took a slow step forward. I threw the handful of sludge violently across the tunnel, aiming for the opposite wall 20 feet ahead of him. The heavy, wet mass hit the brick with a loud, distinct smack, sliding into the water with a heavy splash. The operative reacted instantly. The green laser snapped toward the sound. The suppressed rifle coughed twice, the bullets chewing into the brickwork across the tunnel. His attention, his thermal focus, and the barrel of his weapon were entirely committed to the diversion. I exploded from the water. I did not fire the Walther. The noise would echo, alerting the men above. I lunged forward, using the resistance of the water as leverage, closing the 5-foot gap in a single, explosive movement. I collided with the heavy mass of the operative. His tactical gear was hard, unyielding armor. I brought my left forearm up, slamming it against the barrel of his rifle, pushing it wide. With my right hand, I bypassed the firearm entirely. I drove the steel barrel of the Walther PPK directly into the soft, unprotected tissue beneath his jaw, angling upward. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot was muffled by the proximity to flesh and the thick neoprene of his balaclava. It was a dull, heavy thump that vibrated up my arm. The 9mm round severed his brainstem, destroying his central nervous system instantly. The operative went completely rigid for a microsecond, the heavy night vision goggles slipping from his face before all the tension evaporated from his body. He collapsed forward, a dead weight driving me backward into the freezing water. I did not let go of the gun. I rode the body down, submerging both of us in the black, putrid liquid. The thrashing of his dying nerves sent ripples through the tunnel. I pushed the corpse off me, gasping for air as I broke the surface. The water around me felt suddenly, sickeningly warm. The green laser sight of the dropped rifle illuminated the swirling, blood-soaked water, casting an eerie, pale glow over the narrow tunnel. Dmitri surfaced beside me. He looked at the floating body, then up at my face. The dim green light caught the razor-sharp cut on my cheek. The blood washed away by the foul water, leaving a pale, gaping line. I reached down into the water, my fingers searching the tactical vest of the dead operative. I found a heavy, waterproof flashlight. I pulled it free and clicked it on. The beam of pure white light shattered the darkness. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, a claustrophobic cylinder of decaying brick and rust. "He was the point man," Dmitri said, picking up the fallen operative's suppressed rifle, checking the chamber with a mechanical clack. If he does not report back in 2 minutes, they will drop grenades down the shaft. Then we are gone in one, I replied. I did not look at the dead man. The physical act of murder, the visceral intimacy of feeling a human life end against the barrel of my gun, did not register as trauma. It registered as data. It was the absolute, irrefutable proof that I was no longer the architect moving pieces on a board from the safety of a server room. Vincenzo had forced me back into the mud. He had stripped away my money, my capos, and my illusions of control. He had reduced me to an animal fighting for survival in the dark, and in doing so, he had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought my power came from the Vanguard Trust. He thought my authority came from the loyalists he had just slaughtered in the safe house. He believed that by destroying my infrastructure, he destroyed me. He forgot who my father was. He forgot the bloodline that ran through my veins. The Russo family did not build its empire in boardrooms. It built it on cobblestones, with knives in the dark and absolute, uncompromising violence. I waded forward, leading the way with the flashlight beam. The freezing temperature of the water no longer registered. The pain in my cheek was a distant hum. My pulse settled into a cold, metronomic rhythm, a steady drumbeat of pure, unadulterated vengeance. We moved silently for 20 minutes, navigating the labyrinthine network of the storm sewers. The water level began to drop, receding to our ankles as the tunnel widened, the brick giving way to poured concrete. The distant, rhythmic rumbling of subway trains began to vibrate through the walls. We emerged into an abandoned maintenance corridor deep beneath the city. The air here was dry, smelling of ozone, hot iron, and brake dust. I switched off the flashlight. Faint, yellow light bled through a rusted ventilation grate at the far end of the corridor. We walked toward the light. I stopped in front of the grate. Through the rusted metal bars, I could see the deserted platform of a decommissioned subway station. The tiled walls were covered in decades of grime and graffiti. A single flickering fluorescent tube cast a sickly, jaundiced glow over the concrete platform. We were completely off the grid. No cameras, no Volkov operatives. Just the subterranean silence of the forgotten city. I pushed the heavy grate. It shrieked in protest, the rusted hinges crumbling, and fell outward onto the platform with a harsh clang. I stepped out into the dim light. My cashmere coat was ruined, saturated with foul water and blood, hanging off my frame like heavy armor. My boots left wet, dark footprints on the dusty tiles. Dmitri followed, keeping the suppressed rifle raised, scanning the shadows of the empty station. He leaned against a concrete pillar, his face pale, his breathing shallow. The blood loss from his arm was beginning to take a toll. He had maintained his operational efficiency through sheer willpower, but the biology was catching up to the machine. "We need a medical safe house," Dmitri grunted, his eyes fixed on the dark tunnel where the tracks disappeared into the gloom. "The Volkov perimeter will not extend this far south, but Rocco knows the protocols. He will have men watching the clinics in Brooklyn." I stood in the center of the empty platform, looking down at the Walther PPK in my hand. The steel was cold, unfeeling. It was a tool of finality. "We are not going to a clinic," I said. My voice echoed off the tiled walls, a flat, dead sound completely devoid of the panic Vincenzo expected me to feel. I turned to look at Dmitri. The massive Russian lieutenant was the last remnant of my shadow army, the last piece on my board. He was loyal, brutal, and currently bleeding out in an abandoned subway station. Vincenzo had drawn a masterpiece of a trap. He had weaponized my own arrogance. He sat in my father's chair, drinking my father's scotch, believing he had outsmarted the Queen. He expected me to run. He expected me to hide in the shadows, licking my wounds, desperately trying to rebuild my network from the ashes. He expected the ghost to act like a ghost. I raised the Walther, ejecting the magazine. 3 rounds left. I snapped the magazine back into the grip. The sharp, metallic click was incredibly loud in the silence. "We are not rebuilding, Dmitri," I stated, the cold clarity locking into a flawless, lethal architecture in my mind. Vincenzo bought Rocco with the promise of violence. He bought Volkov with the promise of money. He built a mercenary army based entirely on leverage and profit. I walked toward the rusted iron staircase leading up to the street level, my wet boots heavy on the concrete. Mercenaries do not fight for ghosts, I continued, stopping at the bottom of the stairs. I looked back at Dimitri. The flickering fluorescent light caught the absolute, terrifying void in my eyes. They fight for whoever holds the most terrifying hand. Vincenzo thinks he cleared the board. He doesn't realize he just locked himself in a room with a dead woman who has nothing left to lose. I looked up the dark stairwell toward the heavy steel doors leading to the surface of the city. The rain was still falling. "We are going back to Staten Island," I whispered. The rusted iron stairs of the decommissioned subway station groaned under my weight. Each step was a negotiation with the failing muscle fibers in my legs. The freezing water of the storm sewer had leached the heat from my core, leaving a deep, vibrating numbness that made my wet cashmere coat feel like a shroud of lead. Dimitri followed one step behind me, his massive frame casting a long, jagged shadow against the filthy tiled wall in the flickering fluorescent light. His breathing was a harsh, wet rasp. We reached the surface, pushing open a heavy, unmarked steel grate hidden in the shadow of a condemned tenement building on Muith Avenue. The rain had not stopped. It had intensified into a torrential, freezing deluge that hammered the empty streets of Hell's Kitchen. The city was a sprawling, indifferent monolith of wet asphalt and yellow streetlights bleeding into the dark. I stood on the corner, the Walther PPK hanging by my side, the cold rain washing the remaining sewer sludge from my face. Half a block down, an old Mutnginchin Chamchinmui's Ford Econoline van sat idling next to a chain-link fence. The side panel read, "Apex Commercial Plumbing." The driver was leaning against the steering wheel, a lit cigarette glowing faintly in the dark cab, the radio playing low, distorted jazz. He was a night shift worker, taking a break in the storm. I did not break my stride. I walked directly toward the van. Dimitri moved silently to the passenger side. I approached the driver's window. The glass was rolled down 2 inches to let the cigarette smoke escape. The smell of cheap tobacco and stale coffee drifted into the freezing air. I raised the Walther, tapping the cold steel barrel against the glass. The driver jumped, his head snapping toward the window. His eyes widened, taking in the sight of a woman soaked in blood and sewer water, holding a suppressed weapon inches from his face. The cigarette slipped from his lips, landing on the dirty floorboard. "Step out," I said. My voice was completely flat, a dead frequency that offered no room for negotiation. He did not argue. The primal instinct of survival overrode any attachment to a company vehicle. He unlocked the door, his hands raised, trembling violently. He backed away into the freezing rain, his eyes locked on the black hole of the suppressor. I climbed into the driver's seat. The vinyl was cracked and warm. Dimitri slid into the passenger side, pulling the heavy door shut with a solid clank. I dropped the van into gear and pressed the accelerator. We left the plumber standing in the rain, a ghost story he would never be able to fully explain. The heater in the van rattled, blasting dry, hot air that smelled of dust and burning oil. It did nothing to thaw the ice in my veins. "Staten Island," Dimitri grunted, tearing a strip of heavy duct tape from a roll sitting on the dashboard. He wrapped it tightly around his left bicep, pulling the fabric of his navy trench coat taut over the bullet wound to compress the bleeding. "The Verrazzano Bridge will be monitored. Vincenzo will have spotters on the toll plazas." "Vincenzo relies on Volkov's men for external security," I replied, gripping the steering wheel. The cheap plastic felt strange after years of driving imported leather. "Volkov's men are mercenaries. They look for tactical threats. They look for armored SUVs and strike teams. They do not look for a stolen plumbing van." We drove south, navigating the slick, desolate arteries of the city. The rain battered the windshield, the wipers struggling to clear the heavy sheets of water. The Verrazzano Narrows Bridge loomed out of the fog, a massive suspension structure suspended over the black, churning water of the Narrows. The toll plaza was illuminated by harsh sodium lights. I slowed the van, merging into the commercial lane. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw a black Dodge Charger parked on the shoulder just beyond the booths. 2 men sat inside, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of a dashboard laptop. Spotters. I kept my eyes straight ahead, my posture slouched, mimicking the exhausted drag of a blue-collar worker finishing a graveyard shift. The van rolled past the charger. The spotters did not look up. We crossed the bridge, the massive steel cables humming a low, vibrating note in the storm. Staten Island was dark, the sprawling suburban grid hidden beneath the heavy canopy of ancient oak trees. The Russo family estate sat on 10 acres of prime, elevated real estate overlooking the water. It was a fortress masquerading as a mansion. 12-foot wrought iron gates, reinforced concrete perimeter walls, and an array of high-definition thermal cameras covering every angle of approach. I did not drive to the main gate. I bypassed the affluent residential streets, navigating the van down a narrow, unpaved service road that snaked through a dense patch of coastal woods flanking the eastern edge of the property. The road ended abruptly at a rusted chain-link fence blocking access to the rocky shoreline. I killed the engine. The silence of the woods rushed in, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the metal roof. "The sea wall," I said, opening the door. Dimitri stepped out, gripping his suppressed empinum. He did not question the route. We climbed the rusted fence and descended the treacherous, slick rocks toward the crashing black waves of the Atlantic. The smell of salt, decaying seaweed and freezing rain was overpowering. We moved along the jagged shoreline, the icy spray soaking my coat all over again. The eastern perimeter wall of the estate met the ocean in a sheer, 40-foot drop of poured concrete. At the base of this wall, hidden behind a massive outcropping of jagged granite, was an iron grate, heavily corroded by decades of salt air. It was an intake vent for the estate's original subterranean heating system, constructed in the 1920s by a bootlegger who needed a discreet way to move whiskey from the shore to the cellars. My father had sealed it from the inside when he bought the property, believing it to be a relic. He had not poured concrete, he had simply locked a heavy steel door at the top of the shaft. I reached the grate. The iron was freezing, covered in sharp barnacles. I gripped the bars. The salt had eaten through the structural integrity of the hinges. I pulled. The metal groaned, a harsh, scraping sound against the concrete, and gave way. I squeezed through the narrow opening, entering a dark, slanted concrete tunnel. The air inside was completely dead, smelling of ancient dust, dry rot, and oxidized metal. Dimitri followed, his broad shoulders barely clearing the concrete edges. We crawled upward in pitch blackness. The incline was steep, the rough concrete tearing the knees of my trousers and scraping the skin off my palms. The physical exertion demanded oxygen my lungs struggled to pull from the stale air. After 50 feet of agonizing ascent, my hand struck a solid, flat surface, the steel door. I ran my fingers over the cold metal, finding the heavy deadbolt mechanism. It was locked from the other side. I shifted my weight, bringing my knees up in the cramped space. I reached into the deep pocket of my ruined coat and pulled out the Walther. I pressed the muzzle directly against the housing of the deadbolt, using the fabric of my sleeve to muffle the seal. I pulled the trigger. The suppressed shot was a dull thud in the confined shaft. The lock mechanism shattered instantly, raining sharp fragments of steel onto my lap. I pushed the door. It swung upward, heavy and protesting, opening into the cavernous darkness of the estate's wine cellar. I climbed out of the shaft, pulling myself onto the smooth, cool terracotta tiles of the cellar floor. Dimitri emerged behind me, his heavy breathing the only sound in the vast room. The cellar smelled of aged oak, cork, and the rich, heavy scent of old money. Rows upon rows of vintage Bordeaux and Barolo stretched into the gloom, a testament to decades of uninterrupted power. We moved through the aisles of wine racks, our wet boots making microscopic squeaks against the terracotta. At the top of the cellar stairs was a heavy oak door leading to the main corridor of the ground floor. Faint, warm light bled from beneath the gap. I stopped at the top of the stairs, pressing my ear against the thick wood. The heavy, rhythmic pacing of tactical boots on marble. 2 men. The scent of damp wool and cheap Russian tobacco seeped through the wood. Volkov's perimeter guards had breached the interior of my home. I gripped the heavy brass handle of the door. I looked back at Dmitri. He raised the MP numb, centering the barrel on the wood. I turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping smoothly into the corridor. The two operatives were standing 20 feet away, near the archway leading to the grand foyer. They wore black tactical gear, their rifles slung loosely across their chests. They were relaxed, confident in the absolute security of the estate. They turned at the sound of the opening door. Dmitri fired from over my right shoulder. Peft, peft. Two subsonic rounds struck the operative on the left, punching through his ceramic plate and dropping him instantly. The operative on the right reacted with brutal speed, his hand flying to his holstered sidearm, his mouth opening to shout a warning. I raised the Walther, extending my arm fully, and pulled the trigger. The round took him perfectly in the bridge of the nose. His head snapped backward, a mist of crimson painting the imported silk wallpaper, and he collapsed onto the imported Carrara marble floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The corridor fell silent again. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked its steady, relentless rhythm. Tick, tock. The air in the house was thick with the scent of beeswax polish, expensive floral arrangements, and the lingering smoke of Vincenzo's cigars. It was the scent of my childhood, violently corrupted by the copper tang of fresh blood. We moved down the corridor, stepping over the corpses. The architecture of the estate was ingrained in my muscle memory. I knew the exact blind spots of the internal security cameras. I knew which floorboards creaked. I moved with the silent, predatory grace of a ghost haunting its own grave. As we approached the grand kitchen, a faint sound drifted through the open archway. The clinking of silverware against porcelain. The sound of chewing. I pressed my back against the wall, edging toward the archway. I peered around the corner. The grand kitchen was a massive expanse of stainless steel and white marble. The overhead lights were dimmed. Sitting at the central island, a massive plate of cold, rare steak in front of him, was Rocco Valenti. He was alone. His heavy leather jacket was unzipped. A customized Colt, 1911, rested on the marble countertop next to his plate. He chewed a large piece of meat, his jaw working rhythmically, his eyes staring blankly at the dark window overlooking the rain-swept gardens. He smelled of mint aftershave, cordite, and the primal sweat of a man who had just finished butchering his own brothers. I stepped fully into the archway, lowering the Walther to my side. "You always ate when the adrenaline dropped, Rocco," I said. My voice was smooth, carrying effortlessly across the large room. Rocco stopped chewing. He did not jump. He did not dive for the Colt on the counter. His massive shoulders simply locked into place, rigid and tense. He swallowed the meat slowly. He reached for a linen napkin, wiping his mouth with deliberate care, before turning his head to look at me. His dark eyes registered the blood, the filth, the ruined cashmere coat, and the cold, dead void in my stare. He looked past me, spotting the massive silhouette of Dmitri standing guard in the corridor. "The water was colder than you thought, Clara," Rocco rumbled, his gravelly voice echoing off the stainless steel appliances. He did not reach for his gun. He recognized the tactical geometry of the room. He was dead the moment he twitched. "Sal trusted you," I said, taking a slow step into the kitchen. "Jimmy trusted you. They followed you into a concrete box because you carried my seal. You slaughtered the only men in this city who actually respected you." Rocco let out a harsh, bitter chuckle. It was a sound devoid of humor, dry as dust. He leaned back in his stool, resting his heavy hands flat on the marble island. "Respect." Rocco spat the word as if it were a curse. "Respect doesn't hold territory, Clara. Respect doesn't stop the Russians from moving on the ports. I respected your father because he was a wolf." He bit first. He let the blood flow in the streets, so everyone knew who owned the pavement. "And you think Vincenzo is a wolf?" I asked, closing the distance to 10 feet. The Walther hung loosely, but my finger rested on the trigger guard. "Vincenzo is a suit," Rocco sneered. "He's an accountant, playing dress-up. But he understands the math of the new world. You were trying to build a shadow empire, hiding behind keyboards and offshore trusts. You wanted to rule without getting blood on your hands. In this life, Clara, if you don't show them the blood, they forget you have teeth. So you sold me to the accountant. I didn't sell you. Rocco's eyes hardened, a flash of genuine, brutal conviction cutting through his cynical demeanor. Vincenzo came to me with the Volkov contract. He showed me the Russian army. He showed me the endgame. You were going to let the family slowly suffocate in the dark. Vincenzo gave me the green light to take the Westies, to take the Queen's factions, to consolidate the city under one heavy fist. I chose the fist over the ghost. The smell of the rare steak suddenly turned my stomach. The absolute, terrifying clarity of Rocco's logic laid bare the fundamental flaw in my architecture. I had tried to modernize a beast that only understood raw meat. I raised the Walther, aiming directly at the center of Rocco's broad chest. You chose wrong, I stated. Rocco did not beg. He did not plead for his life. He was a creature of the old world, and he understood the consequences of a failed bet. He looked down at the barrel of the gun, then back up to my face. Before you pull that trigger, Clara, Rocco said, his voice dropping to a heavy, conspiratorial whisper, ask yourself one question. If Vincenzo is just a terrified accountant, how did he get the $50 million to buy Volkov's army? The question struck the exact jagged thread I had been pulling on since Chinatown. Lau traced the wire, I said, my voice tight. It came from an account in Geneva bearing your signature. Rocco laughed again, louder this time, a dark, wheezing sound that rattled in his chest. My signature? Clara. I can barely balance a checkbook. I don't have accounts in Geneva. I don't even have a passport. The air in the kitchen grew stagnant. The heavy block of ice in my chest expanded. If it wasn't your account, I breathed, the realization beginning to form, horrifying and precise. Who initiated the transfer? Vincenzo showed me the ledger when he bought me. Rocco leaned forward, his dark eyes burning with a sadistic, final triumph. The money didn't come from my account, and it didn't come from his. The $50 million was pulled directly from the family pension fund. The pension fund. The invisible pool of clean money that only I controlled. The funds protected by a biometric lock and a dual authentication cipher that rested exclusively in the Vanguard Trust. Impossible, I whispered. Nothing is impossible when you own the man who writes the laws. Rocco grunted. He moved. It was a suicidal lunge, driven by pure, explosive muscle memory. He didn't reach for the Colt on the counter. He threw his massive body forward, grabbing the edge of the marble island, attempting to flip the heavy structure toward me to disrupt my line of sight. I pulled the trigger twice. The suppressed rounds hit him mid-lunge. The first caught his throat, shattering the trachea. The second pierced his heart. Rocco crashed onto the floor, pulling a cascade of silverware and shattered plates down with him. He convulsed once, a massive shudder of dying muscle, and went perfectly still. The smell of his mint aftershave was instantly obliterated by the overwhelming stench of voided bowels and arterial blood. I stood over his body, my breathing perfectly controlled, my hands steady. But inside my skull, the architecture was collapsing, massive stone pillars falling into dust. The man who writes the laws. Vincenzo had not hacked the Vanguard Trust. Volkov had not hacked the Vanguard Trust. There was only one other person on the face of the earth who knew the legal architecture of the pension fund. The man who had set it up for my father 30 years ago. The man who handled the deepest, darkest legal maneuvers for the Russo family. Sterling, the old, exhausted attorney who had slid the declaration of death in absentia across Vincenzo's desk. Vincenzo was not the mastermind. He was the puppet. Sterling had orchestrated the entire hostile takeover. Sterling had manipulated the accountant, used the family's own hidden wealth to buy a Russian mercenary army, and orchestrated the assassination of the true heir to ensure his complete, invisible control over the Russo Empire. Vincenzo signed the death certificate because Sterling told him to. I turned away from Rocco's corpse. The cold fury in my blood was no longer a burning fire. It was absolute zero. I walked out of the kitchen, gesturing for Dmitri to follow. We moved silently up the Grand, sweeping staircase leading to the executive wing of the estate. The plush carpeting absorbed the sound of our wet boots. The heavy, double oak doors of the master study stood at the end of the corridor. Two of Volkov's heavily armored operatives stood guard outside. Dmitri did not wait for my signal. He stepped out from the top of the stairs, the MP num raised. Perfect. A rapid, surgical burst of fire. The subsonic rounds found the gaps in their body armor, striking necks and exposed faces. The guards dropped silently, their heavy bodies sliding down the oak doors, smearing thick red trails on the polished wood. I stepped over the guards. I did not bother checking the handles. I kicked the center seam of the double doors with the flat of my boot. The heavy doors slammed inward, crashing against the interior walls with a deafening boom. The executive study was bathed in the warm, amber glow of the fireplace and the heavy brass desk lamps. The smell of expensive cigar smoke, aged leather, and Macallan scotch filled the room. Vincenzo was sitting behind the mahogany desk. He was not celebrating. The crystal tumbler of scotch rested untouched near his elbow. His charcoal Tom Ford suit jacket was draped over the back of the chair. His tie was loosened. His sleeves were rolled up. His face was bathed in the pale, harsh light of a laptop screen resting in the center of the desk. He jumped violently as the doors crashed open, a startled, pathetic gasp escaping his throat. His hands flew off the keyboard, his eyes wide, terrified. He stared at me. He looked at the blood soaking my clothes, the pale, jagged cut on my cheek, the cold, dead void in my eyes, and the suppressed Walther PPK aimed directly at his chest. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout for his guards. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shaking that rattled the heavy desk. "Clara," he whispered. The word carried the distinct, horrifying realization of a man staring at a ghost that had crawled out of the ocean to drag him to hell. I walked slowly into the room, my boots leaving wet stains on the priceless Persian rug. I stopped exactly 5 feet from the desk. Dmitri stepped into the room behind me, closing the shattered oak doors, leaning his massive, bleeding frame against the wood, securing the exit. "You look tired, Vincenzo," I said. The quiet, conversational tone of my voice seemed to terrify him more than a scream. Vincenzo swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He looked at the gun, then up at my face. The sweat on his forehead caught the amber light. The scent of his fear was sour, acidic, cutting through the expensive cologne. You were on the boat," Vincenzo stammered, his voice cracking. "The Coast Guard, the Seabourn. I smelled the plastic explosives on your cuffs 3 weeks ago." "Vincenzo," I replied, keeping the gun perfectly level. "I hired a diver to plant the detonator on a timer. I watched the yacht burn from a cliff in Montauk." Vincenzo collapsed back into the leather chair, the fight completely leaving his body. He raised his hands, palms outward, a gesture of absolute surrender. "Clara, listen to me," he begged, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "You don't understand the geometry of this. I didn't want to kill you. I swear to God. I didn't have a choice. You had a choice to sign the death certificate," I said, taking 1 step closer. "You had a choice to authorize Volkov to massacre my capos in Hell's Kitchen. You sit in my father's chair, you drink his scotch, and you tell me you didn't have a choice." Vincenzo's eyes darted frantically to the laptop screen, then back to me. Terror, born of pure, unadulterated terror, leaked from the corner of his eye and tracked down his pale cheek. "I am not sitting in his chair, Clara," Vincenzo cried out, his voice shrill. "I am a hostage in it. Look at the screen. Look at the ledger." He violently spun the laptop around so the screen faced me. I did not lower the gun. I cast my eyes downward, taking in the data displayed on the glowing monitor. It was a real-time banking interface. The Vanguard Trust. The master console for the pension fund. The account balances were 0. Every single shell corporation, every legitimate holding company, every offshore routing number had been systematically drained. Hundreds of millions of dollars, the accumulated wealth of the Russo Empire, built over 40 years of blood and extortion, was completely gone. "Sterling," I whispered, the final puzzle piece locking into place with a sickening, heavy thud. "He owns the backdoor codes," Vincenzo sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "He always owned them. He built the legal structure for your father. He built the traps. 3 months ago, he came to me. He showed me he had the keys. He said if I didn't follow his exact script, he would drain the accounts, hand the evidence of our operations to the FBI, and let the family rot in federal prison." The psychological chokehold tightened around my neck. The air in the study felt incredibly thin. Vincenzo was a terrified clerk who had been handed a script by a master manipulator. Sterling had forced Vincenzo to buy the Seabourn. Sterling had forced Vincenzo to sign the death certificate. Sterling had forced him to hire Volkov. Vincenzo was the perfect fall guy, the ambitious, treacherous husband who murders his wife for the throne. If the coup succeeded, Sterling ruled from the shadows. If the coup failed, Vincenzo took the bullets. Sterling initiated the transfer to Volkov. I said, my mind racing through the sheer terrifying scale of the betrayal. "He paid Volkov to secure the perimeter." Vincenzo wept, his shoulders shaking. "He needed me alive long enough to legally sign over the legitimate real estate holdings to his shell corporations. I was just finishing the transfers when you kicked the doors in." Vincenzo looked up, his face a wet, pathetic mask of desperation. "He took the money, Clara. He took everything. He's on a private jet to a non-extradition country right now. We have nothing. The family is broke. The Russians are outside. The capos are dead. We lost." I stared at the sniveling man sitting behind my father's desk, the man I had chosen to be my shield, who had crumbled at the first application of leverage. The Chin Mui Chin Fan Trum was absolute ruin. The empire was dismantled. The wealth was stolen. The army was decimated. Sterling had executed the perfect crime, leaving me holding the ashes of my own kingdom. But Sterling was a lawyer. He thought in terms of contracts, ledgers, and legal maneuvers. He thought like an architect, designing a building on paper. He did not think like a monster standing in the dark. I looked at the glowing 0 on the laptop screen. I looked at Vincenzo's terrified, tear-streaked face. A cold, dark rhythm began to beat in my chest, a slow, relentless pulse that pushed the freezing numbness from my veins, replacing it with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "He took the money," I whispered, the sound carrying a strange, hollow echo in the quiet study. "It's gone, Clara," Vincenzo choked out. "We are dead. Money does not buy loyalty, Vincenzo," I said, raising the Walther PPK until the suppressor was aimed exactly at the center of his forehead. "Money buys mercenaries, and mercenaries are only loyal to the man who pays them." Vincenzo froze, staring down the barrel of the gun. "What are you talking about?" "Sterling paid Volkov $50 million to secure this perimeter tonight," I said, the cold, dark fire spreading through my mind, illuminating a path paved entirely in blood. "He paid them to protect the new boss of the Russo family." I stepped forward, pressing the cold steel of the suppressor directly against Vincenzo's forehead. He whimpered, squeezing his eyes shut. "Sterling is on a plane," I whispered, the words drifting into the silence like toxic smoke. "He is gone. He is no longer signing the checks." The missing link, the fatal flaw in Sterling's perfect architecture. He had stolen the wealth, but he had left the physical assets, the heavily armed Russian mercenary army surrounding the estate, waiting for orders from the man sitting in the executive chair. "Open your eyes, Vincenzo," I commanded. He slowly opened his eyes, trembling violently. "You are going to pick up the radio on your desk," I instructed, my voice a flat, dead frequency. "You are going to contact the Volkov strike team commander. You are going to tell him that a hostile force breached the perimeter, and you are going to tell him to initiate a total purge of all unauthorized personnel on the island." Vincenzo stared at me, the confusion battling the terror in his eyes. "But they work for Volkov. They won't take orders from me. They take orders from whoever holds the contract," I replied, my finger tightening on the trigger. "And right now Volkov thinks the contract is yours. He doesn't know Sterling drained the accounts. He doesn't know the money is gone. I leaned closer, the smell of his fear overpowering the scent of the scotch. Use the Russians to kill the Russians, I whispered. Order the perimeter guards to collapse inward. Order them to execute the internal security detail. Let them butcher each other on the lawn. Vincenzo hesitated, his hand hovering over the heavy black tactical radio resting on the edge of the desk. He was trying to calculate the odds, trying to find an angle where he survived. "And if I do this?" Vincenzo asked, his voice shaking. "If I give the order, what happens to me?" I looked at the man who had ordered my death, the man who had handed my capos to a slaughterhouse. The cold logic of the underworld demands a balance. "If you do not pick up the radio," I said, the suppressor digging painfully into his skin, "I pull the trigger. And you die a terrified accountant sitting in a puddle of your own urine." Vincenzo swallowed hard. His trembling hand dropped to the desk, his fingers wrapped around the heavy plastic of the tactical radio. He lifted it slowly. He looked at me one last time, searching for a trace of the woman he had married. He found nothing but the absolute, freezing void of the abyss. He pressed the transmit button. The heavy plastic of the tactical radio crackled, emitting a sharp, static hiss that sliced through the suffocating silence of the study. Vincenzo's thumb pressed down on the transmit button. The tendons in his hand stood out, pale and strained. "Command actual," Vincenzo breathed into the microphone. His voice was a ragged, wet vibration. He cleared his throat, desperately trying to summon the authority of a boss he had never truly been. "This is Russo, Code Black. Internal security detail is compromised. The guards inside the house are hostile. Initiate immediate purge. Kill them all." He released the button. The silence that followed was agonizing. The heavy grandfather clock in the distant foyer ticked. The rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the bay windows. I did not move the Walther PPK. The suppressor remained perfectly centered on the bridge of his nose. A burst of static. Then a thick, heavily accented voice rumbled through the speaker. "Copy, Russo. Engaging internal targets. Securing the perimeter." Vincenzo let the radio slip from his fingers. It clattered onto the mahogany desk, knocking over the crystal tumbler. The 25-year-old Macallan spilled across the polished wood, soaking into the edges of the death certificate. 3 seconds later, the estate erupted. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of suppressed assault rifles echoed from the ground floor. It was followed instantly by the deafening, unsuppressed roar of answering fire from the internal guards. The Volkov mercenaries manning the perimeter had breached the doors, turning their weapons on the Volkov mercenaries stationed inside the house. The architecture of the slaughter was flawlessly executing itself. Men who shared the same uniforms, the same language, and the same syndicate were butchering each other in my hallways, entirely unaware that the order came from a terror. The muffled sound of a grenade detonating in the west wing shook the floorboards beneath my wet boots. Plaster dust drifted down from the coffered ceiling, sparkling faintly in the amber light of the brass desk lamps. Vincenzo shrank back into the leather chair, covering his ears, his eyes squeezed shut against the concussive vibrations. The smell of his sweat was sour, desperate, mingling aggressively with the sharp scent of spilled scotch. "It's done," Vincenzo choked out, keeping his hands clamped over his ears. "They are killing each other. The perimeter is collapsing inward. We can leave, Clara. We can use the service tunnels. We can disappear." I lowered the Walther. The cold steel dropped to my side. I stepped forward, moving around the edge of the mahogany desk until I stood directly beside his chair. I looked down at the laptop screen. The Vanguard Trust interface still displayed the absolute zero balance, the empty void where the Russo Empire's wealth had once resided. "Sterling was a meticulous man," I said. My voice was a flat, dead frequency, barely audible over the escalating gunfire echoing through the floor. He drafted the legal loopholes. He structured the shell corporations. He knew exactly how to dismantle the family's assets without triggering a federal audit. Vincenzo opened his eyes. He looked up at me, his face a mask of pathetic, desperate hope. "He stole it all. But we are alive, Clara. We survived." "He stole nothing," I whispered. I reached out with my left hand, my fingers slick with the freezing sewer water and the blood of the operative I had killed in the tunnel. I placed my index finger on the biometric scanner built into the corner of the laptop's keyboard. The scanner flashed a sharp, piercing green. The Vanguard interface on the screen vanished. The glowing 0 disappeared. It was replaced by a heavily encrypted black market routing portal. A sequence of offshore accounts materialized, based in jurisdictions that did not exist on standard financial maps. The numbers began to populate. 50 million, 200 million, 800 million. The complete, liquidated sum of the Russo family's accumulated wealth, transferred seamlessly, entirely intact, and completely untraceable. Vincenzo stared at the screen. The color drained from his lips. The desperate hope in his eyes shattered, replaced by a cold, paralyzing incomprehension. The tectonic plates of his reality violently ground against each other, exposing a chasm he could not fathom. "Sterling didn't betray the family, Vincenzo," I said, leaning closer. The smell of cordite drifting up from the grand staircase reached my nose, a bitter, metallic perfume. "Sterling betrayed you because I paid him to." Vincenzo's jaw worked, trying to form words that his brain refused to process. You were dead. You were on the boat. "I needed the money washed," I explained, the clinical detachment in my voice absolute. "The old accounts were tainted. The FBI was circling the pension fund. The capos were getting greedy, demanding larger cuts, threatening to fracture the syndicate. The empire was rotting from the inside out." I traced the edge of the laptop screen with my thumb. I couldn't just liquidate the assets and execute my own command structure. The commission would have me hunted down like a rabid dog. I needed a scapegoat. I needed a tragedy. I needed an ambitious, foolish husband to stage a coup. The heavy oak doors of the study vibrated as a burst of automatic fire chewed through the walls of the corridor outside. Dmitri shifted his massive weight against the wood, his suppressed MP num raised, securing the room while the wolves tore each other apart down the hall. "I instructed Sterling to approach you," I continued, looking down into Vincenzo's terrified, widening eyes. "I instructed him to feed your paranoia, to give you the backdoor codes, to convince you to hire the Volkov syndicate. You thought you were buying an army to secure your throne. You were actually buying the firing squad for my old, useless capos. Rocco." Vincenzo gasped, clutching his chest. "You let Rocco kill Sal and Jimmy." "Rocco was a blunt instrument. He served his purpose. He gathered the rot in one place so you could burn it." I stepped back, raising the Walther PPK. I aligned the sight's dead center with his chest. "Sterling transferred the money into my blind trusts the moment you signed that death certificate," I stated, the final nail being driven into the coffin of his existence. The signature was the legal authorization required to empty the domestic accounts. "You gave me the keys to a clean kingdom, Vincenzo. And then you ordered the Volkov mercenaries to execute the internal guards, erasing the last living witnesses on this estate." Vincenzo looked at the dark barrel of the gun. The absolute, unmitigated scale of his failure crushed the last breath from his lungs. He had never been the architect. He had never even been a player. He was simply the pen I used to rewrite the ledger, and the ink had run dry. He didn't beg. He simply stared into the void. I pulled the trigger. The suppressed round punched through the center of his chest, shattering his sternum and severing his aorta. The kinetic force threw him backward against the high-backed leather chair, his head lolled to the side. A dark, rapidly expanding stain ruined the pristine charcoal fabric of the Tom Ford suit. The heavy crystal tumbler rolled off the edge of the desk, shattering on the floorboards. I did not look at his body. I reached down, pulled the hard drive from the laptop, and slipped it into the pocket of my ruined cashmere coat. The gunfire downstairs began to taper off, replaced by the shouts of wounded men and the crackle of burning upholstery. The Volkov mercenaries had decimated each other. The perimeter was broken. The estate was a tomb. I turned and walked toward the oak doors. Dmitri stepped aside, pulling them open. The corridor was thick with grey smoke and the stench of death. We moved silently down the grand staircase, stepping over the bleeding, pulverized remains of the men who thought they owned the city. We walked out the front doors, stepping into the freezing, relentless storm. The rain washed the blood from my boots as I crossed the gravel driveway, disappearing into the dark, leaving the ashes of the old world burning behind me.